The rain hammered down on the cracked asphalt of Miller's Creek gas station like nature's own judgment day, each drop exploding into 1,000 fragments that seemed to mirror how my entire world had just imploded before my eyes. I stood there, completely drenched to my core, watching the red taillights of Glen's black Escalade disappear into the storm, taking with them not just my only way home, but apparently every single thing I thought I understood about my marriage, my life, and the man I'd trusted for the past 7 years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But what Glen Jensen didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have imagined as he drove away with that smug satisfaction I'd seen creeping across his face, was that in exactly 43 minutes, I would be walking through the front door of our Riverside estate completely dry, flanked by a professional bodyguard, and packing bags. Not my bags, his bags, because the woman he'd just abandoned at this godforsaken gas station wasn't the helpless, dependent wife he thought he was leaving behind. She was someone entirely different, someone with resources he'd never suspected, someone who was about to turn his perfectly orchestrated betrayal into the worst mistake of his entitled life. 43 minutes earlier, Glen had looked me straight in the eye across the white tablecloth of Romano's Steakhouse, the same restaurant where he'd proposed 6 years ago, and delivered what felt like a death sentence disguised as a business decision. "Taylor, I think it's time we discuss the future of our arrangement," he'd said, cutting into his ribeye with the same clinical precision he used for everything else in his life. "This marriage isn't providing the returns I'd anticipated, and I believe we'd both benefit from exploring other opportunities, as if our marriage was a failing stock portfolio that needed restructuring, as if 7 years of my life, 7 years of building what I thought was a partnership, was nothing more than a poor investment that hadn't yielded the dividends he'd expected." The corporate speak should have prepared me for what came next, but somehow the casual cruelty of his next words still managed to knock the breath from my lungs. "I've already retained Blackstone and Associates to handle the paperwork," he'd continued, never once looking up from his perfectly cooked steak. "You'll receive a fair settlement, of course, enough to start fresh somewhere new, somewhere more appropriate to your background and prospects." The emphasis on appropriate had been delivered with the kind of subtle venom that Glen had perfected over our years together, the ability to make me feel small and grateful simultaneously. But the real gut punch had come when I'd asked about getting home, about working out the practical details of this bombshell he'd just dropped into the middle of what I'd thought was supposed to be our anniversary dinner. "Oh, I won't be able to give you a ride tonight," he'd said, with the same tone he might use to decline a dinner invitation. "I have prior commitments that require my immediate attention, but there's a gas station right across the highway, Miller's Creek I think it's called. You can figure something out from there." Prior commitments, even in that moment, with my world crashing down around me, I'd known exactly what those commitments were, or rather, who they were. Kayla White, his 26-year-old executive assistant, who'd been working late an awful lot of evenings lately, who'd been copied on emails that seemed to have nothing to do with Jensen Development Corporation, who'd smiled at me with just a little too much confidence at the company Christmas party 3 months ago. The drive to Miller's Creek had been conducted in complete silence, Glen's jaw set in that familiar expression of righteous determination that meant his mind was made up, and any further discussion would be viewed as an inconvenience. He'd pulled into the gas station parking lot, kept the engine running, and waited with obvious impatience while I'd gathered my purse and the light jacket that was proving completely inadequate against the storm that had been building all evening. "I'll have someone contact you about the details," had been his parting words, delivered through the barely cracked window as I'd stood in the rain beside his car. Then he'd driven away, leaving me standing under the flickering neon lights of a 24-hour convenience store, 47 miles from home, with nothing but my credit cards, which I was beginning to suspect might not work much longer, and the growing realization that the man I'd married had been planning this humiliation for God knows how long. The teenage clerk behind the counter had looked up with bored sympathy as I'd pushed through the glass doors, my designer dress clinging uncomfortably to my skin, and my carefully styled hair hanging in defeated strings around my face. The store smelled like stale coffee, and the kind of industrial disinfectant that never quite covered up whatever it was trying to mask. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry insects, casting everything in a harsh, unforgiving glare that made me feel exposed and ridiculous. But as I'd stood there, dripping on the scratched linoleum floor, and trying to process the magnitude of what had just happened, something unexpected had begun to stir in my chest. Not the crushing despair Glen had probably been counting on, not the panicked helplessness that would send me crawling back to accept whatever scraps he was willing to throw me. Instead, it was something sharper, something that felt almost like relief mixed with a cold, calculating anger I hadn't known I was capable of. Because Glen Jensen had made a fundamental miscalculation. He'd assumed that 7 years of marriage had been enough to completely inventory my resources, my connections, my capabilities. He'd assumed that the Taylor Gray he'd married, the small-town girl who'd been so grateful for his attention, so eager to fit into his world of country clubs and charity galas, was the same woman standing in this gas station tonight. He'd assumed that the private investigator I'd quietly retained 3 months ago, when his late nights at the office had become impossible to ignore, had been a waste of money. He'd assumed that the offshore accounts and property holdings he thought he'd hidden so cleverly would stay hidden. Most critically, he'd assumed that my Uncle Maddox Styles, the uncle who'd made his fortune in private security, and had always told me to call if I ever needed anything, anything at all, was just a colorful family character with no real influence in the sophisticated world Glen inhabited. All of those assumptions were about to be tested in ways that Glen couldn't possibly have anticipated. Because while he was driving home to his executive assistant, and his plans for a new life, funded by assets he thought I'd never discover, I was making a phone call that would change everything. "Uncle Maddox," I'd said when he answered on the second ring, despite the late hour. "It's Taylor. I think it's time I took you up on that offer you made at Christmas. I need help, and I need it tonight." The phone call with Uncle Maddox had lasted exactly 4 minutes and 17 seconds. I know because I'd been staring at the convenience store's wall clock the entire time, watching the second hand tick away what felt like the final moments of my old life. Maddox Styles had listened without interruption, as I'd explained Glen's abandonment, his voice growing progressively colder with each detail I'd shared. "Stay exactly where you are, sweetheart," he'd said in that gravelly tone that had intimidated my childhood friends and comforted me in equal measure. "Don't move, don't call anyone else, and don't you dare let that son of a bitch make you feel like you're the problem here. I'm sending someone to get you, and we're going to have a very interesting conversation about your husband's business practices." That last comment had sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with my rain-soaked clothes. Uncle Maddox didn't make idle threats, and he certainly didn't make vague references to business practices unless he knew something specific. Something Glen probably wasn't going to like. While I waited, I'd found myself studying my reflection in the convenience store's security mirror, trying to reconcile the bedraggled woman staring back at me with the composed wife who'd left for dinner 3 hours earlier. My black cocktail dress, the one Glen had bought me for last year's charity auction, the one he'd said made me look appropriately elegant, now clung to my body like a second skin, ruined beyond repair. My makeup had run in dark streams down my cheeks, and my blonde hair hung in defeated spirals around my shoulders. But there was something else in that reflection, something I hadn't seen in years. A spark of defiance that Glen's systematic conditioning hadn't quite managed to extinguish. The same stubborn determination that had gotten me through college on academic scholarships while working 2 jobs, the same fierce independence that had built a small but successful event planning business before Glen had convinced me that his wife shouldn't need to work. The teenage clerk, his name tag read Brandon, had been stealing glances at me for the past 20 minutes, clearly debating whether to offer help or mind his own business. Finally, he'd approached with a cup of coffee that smelled marginally better than the burnt sludge I could see congealing in the pot behind the counter. "Ma'am, you look like you could use this," he'd said, his voice cracking slightly with adolescent uncertainty. "And there's a towel in the back if you want to dry off some." The simple kindness of the gesture had nearly broken my composure entirely. Here was this kid, probably making minimum wage at a job that required him to deal with drunks and desperate people all night long, and he was showing more consideration for my well-being than my husband had managed in months. "Thank you," I'd managed, accepting the coffee with hands that were finally starting to steady. "That's very kind of you." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As I'd wrapped my fingers around the warm cup, I'd found myself thinking about the last time Glen had shown me genuine kindness, the last time he'd put my comfort before his own convenience. The memory felt ancient, buried under years of subtle criticisms disguised as helpful suggestions, years of decisions made for my own good without consulting me, years of slowly shrinking myself to fit into the space he'd carved out for his wife. When had I stopped being Taylor Gray and become simply Mrs. Glen Jensen? When had I stopped having opinions that mattered, dreams that deserved consideration, needs that required attention? The transformation had been so gradual, so skillfully orchestrated, that I'd barely noticed it happening until tonight, when Glen's casual cruelty had finally stripped away all pretense. My phone had buzzed with a text message, and for one pathetic moment, I'd hoped it might be Glen with an apology, an explanation, something that would make sense of this nightmare. Instead, it had been from an unknown number, vehicle arriving in 3 minutes. Black Suburban, license plate ending in 47K. Driver will identify himself as Carl. True to the timeline, exactly 3 minutes later, a black Chevrolet Suburban with tinted windows had pulled into the gas station parking lot with the quiet confidence of a vehicle that cost more than most people's annual salary. The driver who'd emerged was tall, broad-shouldered, and moved with the kind of controlled precision that suggested military training. His dark suit was impeccably tailored despite the late hour, and his eyes swept the parking lot with the systematic attention of someone accustomed to assessing threats. "Mrs. Jensen?" he'd said as he'd approached the store entrance, his voice carrying the flat, professional tone of someone who took his work very seriously. "I'm Carl White. Mr. Stiles sent me to collect you." Even in my disheveled state, I'd noticed the respect in his demeanor, the way he'd waited for my acknowledgement before proceeding, the careful distance he'd maintained to avoid making me feel threatened or pressured. It was such a stark contrast to Glen's assumption of authority over my decisions that it had taken me a moment to respond. "Yes, that's me," I'd said, then immediately corrected myself with a flash of defiance that surprised us both. "Actually, it's Miss Gray, Taylor Gray." Carl had nodded approvingly, as if my small assertion of independence had confirmed something he'd been told to watch for. "Miss Gray, it is. Shall we go? Mr. Stiles is waiting, and he's eager to discuss your situation." As I'd followed Carl to the Suburban, I'd caught one last glimpse of my reflection in the store window. The woman looking back at me was still bedraggled, still wearing a ruined dress and smeared makeup. But there was something different in her posture, something that spoke of decisions made and bridges burned. Glen Jensen had no idea what he'd unleashed when he'd driven away from Miller's Creek gas station tonight. But he was about to find out. The interior of Carl's Suburban was a study in understated luxury and professional efficiency. Heated leather seats that immediately began warming my rain-chilled body, privacy partition raised between the front and back compartments, and what appeared to be communication equipment discreetly integrated into the dashboard. As we pulled away from Miller's Creek gas station, I found myself staring back at the flickering neon lights that had witnessed my abandonment, already feeling like that terrified woman standing in the rain belonged to someone else's life. Carl had handed me a soft wool blanket and a bottle of water without comment, his attention focused on navigating the storm-slicked highways with the kind of defensive driving that suggested he'd transported people in far more dangerous situations than a messy divorce. The silence in the vehicle wasn't uncomfortable. It felt protective, like a cocoon where I could begin to process what had just happened without judgment or expectation. My phone had buzzed twice during the drive, both calls from Glen's number. I'd stared at the screen each time, watching his name flash insistently before the calls went to voicemail. Part of me, the part that had been conditioned over 7 years to prioritize his needs above my own comfort, wanted to answer, to hear his explanation, to give him the opportunity to make this right somehow. But a stronger part, a part that was growing more assertive by the minute, knew that anything Glen had to say right now would be designed to manipulate rather than illuminate. Instead, I'd used the drive to think clearly for what felt like the first time in months, Glen's behavior tonight hadn't been spontaneous. Nobody retained divorce attorneys and made cryptic references to fair settlements on the spur of the moment. This abandonment had been planned, probably for weeks or even months, while he'd continued to play the role of devoted husband at home. The realization should have been devastating, but instead it felt almost liberating. At least now I knew where I stood. The suburban had turned into an upscale industrial district I didn't recognize, pulling up to a sleek glass building that appeared to be some kind of corporate headquarters. Even at nearly midnight, several windows were lit, suggesting that Maddox Styles operated the kind of business that never truly closed. Carl had escorted me through a private entrance that bypassed the main lobby, leading me directly to an elevator that required a keycard to operate. Mr. Styles is on the 15th floor, Carl had explained as we'd risen smoothly through the building. He's cleared his schedule for the rest of the evening to focus on your situation. The elevator had opened into what was clearly the executive level, polished hardwood floors, museum-quality artwork, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a commanding view of the city sprawling below. Uncle Maddox had been waiting in what appeared to be a conference room, his imposing figure silhouetted against the storm clouds that were finally beginning to break apart outside. At 62, Maddox Styles still carried himself with the bearing of the Marine colonel he'd once been, his silver hair cropped short and his pale blue eyes sharp with intelligence. He'd opened his arms the moment he'd seen me, and for the first time since Glen's abandonment, I'd allowed myself to feel the full weight of what had happened. "There's my girl," he'd said, his voice rough with emotion as he'd wrapped me in the kind of bear hug that made me feel 8 years old again. "Look at you, standing here soaking wet because some entitled bastard thinks he can treat my niece like disposable property." The casual profanity should have shocked me. Glen had trained me to find such language distasteful, but instead it felt validating, like someone was finally calling Glen's behavior what it actually was, instead of making excuses for it. "Uncle Maddox, I don't even know where to start," I'd said, my voice finally beginning to crack under the strain of maintaining composure. "I thought I knew him. I thought I knew what my life was, and then tonight, he just discarded me like I was nothing." Maddox had guided me to a chair at the polished conference table, pouring coffee from a thermal carafe that someone had obviously prepared for this impromptu meeting. The coffee was excellent, nothing like the gas station sludge I'd been drinking earlier, and the familiar ritual of adding cream and sugar had helped ground me in the moment. "Sweetheart, let me tell you something about men like Glen Jensen," Maddox had said, settling into the chair across from me, with the deliberate movements of someone who'd learned to make every gesture count. "They operate under the assumption that everyone around them exists solely for their benefit. They're not capable of seeing other people as fully realized human beings with their own needs, their own rights, their own power." He'd paused to sip his coffee, his eyes never leaving my face. "But here's what Glen doesn't understand about the Gray family. We don't stay down when someone knocks us over. We get back up, we learn from the experience, and we make damn sure it never happens again." The conference room had seemed to pulse with quiet energy as Maddox had spoken, and I'd found myself sitting straighter, feeling something that had been dormant for years beginning to stir back to life. This was the uncle who'd taught me to change my own tire when I was 16, who'd made me take self-defense classes before I'd left for college, who'd always insisted that I was capable of handling whatever life threw at me. "Now," he'd said, leaning forward with the focused intensity that had built his security empire, "tell me everything about Glen's business operations, his associates, his financial arrangements, and his recent behavior patterns. Because if that son of a bitch thinks he can abandon my niece at a gas station and walk away clean, he's about to learn exactly how wrong he can be." As I sat in that polished conference room, warming my hands around the coffee cup, and feeling the weight of Uncle Maddox's protective attention, the floodgates of memory finally opened. What emerged wasn't just tonight's betrayal, but a systematic pattern of manipulation that had been so gradual, so expertly crafted, that I'd mistaken it for love and concern for 7 years. "It started with the small things," I heard myself saying, my voice gaining strength as I began to piece together the puzzle I'd been living inside. "When we were first married, Glen would suggest that certain friends of mine were too dramatic or negative influences. He never forbade me from seeing them. He was too clever for that. Instead, he'd schedule romantic dinners on the same nights as their gatherings. or he'd have sudden work emergencies that required my support. Maddox had pulled out a legal pad and was taking notes with the methodical precision of someone who documented criminal behavior before. Isolation tactics, he'd confirmed grimly. Classic manipulation strategy. What else? The memories came flooding back now that I had a framework to understand them. My event planning business, I'd built it from nothing, had regular clients, was actually making decent money, but Glen convinced me that it was causing too much stress on our marriage. He said he made enough for both of us, that I should focus on being a proper wife instead of playing businesswoman. The phrase still stung even years later. Did he specifically say you couldn't work? Maddox asked, his pen moving steadily across the paper. Never directly, he was always too sophisticated for ultimatums. Instead, he'd schedule important social events that conflicted with my client meetings. He'd invite his business partners over for dinner on the same nights I had events to coordinate. He'd book surprise romantic getaways during my busiest seasons. I paused, understanding flooding through me. Every time I had to choose between my business and his priorities, he made it seem like I was being selfish if I chose work. The pattern had been so insidious that I'd gradually convinced myself that giving up my business was my own decision, a mature choice to prioritize my marriage. Within 2 years, I'd gone from being Taylor Gray, successful entrepreneur, to Mrs. Glen Jensen, whose primary occupation was supporting her husband's ambitions. Financial control? Maddox prompted, though from his expression, he already knew the answer. Complete, I admitted, feeling ashamed of how thoroughly I'd been neutered. He convinced me that managing money was stressful and that he was better suited to handle our finances. I had access to a household account for groceries and personal expenses, but all the major assets were in his name only. He said it was for tax purposes, that his accountant had recommended the arrangement. What I hadn't realized at the time was that this financial architecture had made me completely dependent on Glen's goodwill for everything from clothing to medical care. Without access to credit cards in my own name or savings accounts he couldn't monitor, I'd been effectively trapped in our marriage whether I'd recognized it or not. And the gaslighting? Maddox asked, using a term I'd only recently learned from a late-night psychology article I'd read when I couldn't sleep. The examples came pouring out now, each one more infuriating than the last as I finally understood them for what they were. The time Glen had promised to attend my college roommate's wedding, then claimed he'd never made such a commitment when I'd confronted him about missing it for a golf tournament. The way he'd systematically undermined my memory of conversations, insisting I'd misunderstood his words or taken them out of context. The subtle but constant suggestions that I was too emotional or too sensitive whenever I'd tried to address problems in our relationship. He made me doubt my own perceptions, I said, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. If I questioned his late nights, I was being paranoid. If I wanted to discuss our future plans, I was being needy. If I expressed any dissatisfaction with our relationship, I was being ungrateful for everything he'd provided. Maddox had been writing steadily throughout my recitation, but now he set down his pen and fixed me with those penetrating blue eyes. Taylor, what I'm hearing isn't just marital problems. This is systematic psychological abuse designed to break down your independence and self-confidence. Glen Jensen didn't just decide to leave you tonight, he's been preparing you for abandonment for years. The words hit like a physical blow, but they also brought a strange sense of relief. Someone finally understood that my marriage hadn't just failed, it had been sabotaged from the inside by someone I'd trusted completely. There's something else, I said, remembering the conversation that had been nagging at me since dinner. When Glen was explaining his decision tonight, he mentioned returns on investment and exploring other opportunities. But he also said something about a settlement that would be appropriate to my background and prospects. Like he'd already calculated exactly how little he could get away with giving me. Maddox's expression had darkened considerably. That suggests pre-planning. Detailed pre-planning. Men don't just casually reference settlement negotiations, unless they've already had those conversations with their attorneys. He'd leaned back in his chair, studying me with the kind of tactical assessment that had made him legendary in corporate security circles. Taylor, I need you to think carefully about the past few months. Has Glen done anything unusual with paperwork, financial documents, property transfers? Has he encouraged you to sign anything routine or administrative? As I'd searched my memory, a cold realization had begun to dawn. Last month, Glen had asked me to sign what he'd described as updated insurance forms, claiming his company had changed providers and needed new beneficiary information. I'd signed without reading them carefully, trusting his explanation completely. "Oh God," I'd whispered, understanding finally beginning to form. I think I may have signed away more than just insurance beneficiaries. The implications of what I'd potentially signed hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest. Maddox had immediately pulled out his phone, speed dialing someone despite the late hour. Within minutes, he'd arranged for a forensic document analyst to meet us first thing in the morning, but the damage assessment couldn't wait until business hours. "Describe exactly what you remember about those insurance forms," Maddox said, his voice taking on the crisp efficiency of a military briefing. "Every detail, no matter how small." I closed my eyes, trying to reconstruct that evening in Glen's home office. It was a Tuesday night, about 3 weeks ago. Glen said his HR department needed updated beneficiary information for his life insurance policy. The documents were maybe 8 or 10 pages long. Lots of legal language that I didn't really understand. "Did you read them?" Maddox asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Glen said it was just standard boilerplate, that reading insurance documents was like trying to decipher a foreign language. He pointed to the signature lines and said, I just needed to sign as his spouse to confirm the beneficiary updates. The memory made me feel sick with my own naivety. I trusted him completely. Why would I question insurance paperwork? But as Maddox pressed for more details, the true scope of my vulnerability began to emerge. Those documents had been thick, far more substantial than simple beneficiary forms should have been. Glen had been unusually insistent that I sign them that evening, claiming the HR deadline was the next day. And there had been a notary present, Glen's secretary Kayla White, who was apparently certified to notarize documents. "A notary," Maddox repeated, his voice deadly quiet. "For insurance beneficiary forms, that's not standard procedure, Taylor. Beneficiary designations don't require notarization unless they're part of a larger legal document." The room seemed to tilt as the implications crystallized. Those hadn't been insurance forms, they'd been some kind of legal instrument that I'd signed without reading, without understanding, without even questioning. Property transfers, maybe, or prenuptial amendments, or God knows what else that would leave me with no legal claim to assets I'd helped build during our marriage. How could I have been so stupid? I whispered, the words scraping raw against my throat. 7 years of marriage, and I signed away everything without even reading what I was putting my name to. "You weren't stupid," Maddox said firmly. "You were being systematically deceived by someone who'd spent years conditioning you to trust his judgment over your own instincts. This is exactly what psychological manipulation is designed to accomplish. It makes intelligent people doubt their own intelligence." But even his reassurance couldn't diminish the crushing weight of my situation. I had no independent income, no savings accounts Glen couldn't access, no property in my own name, and now, apparently, no legal claim to anything we'd accumulated during our marriage. I'd been living in a beautiful prison for years without even realizing the bars were there. "There's more," I admitted, the words feeling like shards of glass in my mouth. "Last month, Glen also had me sign papers to close my old personal checking account, the one I'd had since college. He said it was inefficient to maintain multiple accounts when we shared finances anyway. That account had contained the last $3,847 of my independent money, the final remnant of my event planning business, and my personal financial autonomy. I'd signed those closure documents with the same trusting stupidity, effectively cutting my own financial lifeline at Glen's suggestion. "And my credit cards," I continued, each admission feeling like another nail in my coffin. 3 months ago, Glen convinced me to cancel my personal credit cards and add me as an authorized user on his accounts instead. He said it would improve our credit scores and simplify our financial management. Maddox was very still, his pen suspended above his legal pad as he processed the full extent of Glen's preparation. "Taylor, what you're describing isn't just divorce planning, this is financial annihilation. Glen has systematically eliminated every avenue of independent survival you might have had. The reality was suffocating: no business, no independent bank accounts, no credit cards in my own name, no property rights, and quite possibly no legal claim to anything Glen had convinced me to sign away. I was 31 years old, college educated, and had somehow allowed myself to be reduced to complete dependence on a man who just demonstrated exactly how little my welfare meant to him. "I have nothing," I said, the words hollow and final. "No money, no home, no legal standing." Glen didn't just abandon me tonight. He's been systematically stripping away my ability to survive without him for months, maybe years. But even as I spoke those words, I could see something shifting in Uncle Maddox's expression, a cold calculation that suggested he knew something I didn't. "Actually, sweetheart," he said, his voice taking on a dangerous edge, "Glen Jensen may have just made the biggest mistake of his life." The shift in Uncle Maddox's demeanor was subtle but unmistakable, like watching a predator recognize that its prey had just wandered into the perfect trap. He set down his pen with deliberate precision and leaned back in his chair, studying me with an expression that mixed familial protectiveness with professional calculation. "Taylor, I need you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you," he said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that had commanded respect in boardrooms and battlefields alike. "Glen thinks he's been playing chess while you've been playing checkers. What he doesn't realize is that he's been playing against the wrong opponent entirely." I stared at him, confusion mixing with the first faint stirring of something that might have been hope. "I don't understand. You just heard everything. I have nothing left." "He's taken it all, has he?" Maddox asked, reaching into his desk drawer and pulling out a thick manila folder. "Tell me, sweetheart, what do you remember about your grandmother Elena's will?" The question seemed to come from nowhere, yanking my thoughts away from my immediate crisis toward memories I hadn't accessed in years. "Grandma Elena, she died when I was 12, I remember the funeral, but," I trailed off trying to understand the relevance. "Your grandmother left you something very specific," Maddox continued, opening the folder and spreading several official-looking documents across the conference table. "Something your parents decided you were too young to understand at the time, something they asked me to manage until you turned 35, or until you found yourself in a situation where you needed protection from predatory individuals." My hands trembled as I reached for the documents, recognizing the letterhead of a prestigious law firm, and seeing my own name typed in formal legal language. "Uncle Maddox, what is this?" "This," he said, with quiet satisfaction, "is proof that Elena Gray was a lot smarter about money than anyone in the family ever realized. And more importantly, it's proof that Glen Jensen has been systematically defrauding someone who has far more resources than he ever imagined." The documents were trust papers, dated 20 years ago, establishing something called the Elena Gray Protective Trust with me as the sole beneficiary. As I read through the legal language, my understanding of my own life began to shift in ways that felt almost surreal. My grandmother, the woman I remembered as a gentle presence who baked cookies and read me bedtime stories, had apparently been a shrewd investor who'd accumulated a substantial portfolio over her lifetime. "She left me money?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "She left you much more than money," Maddox replied, pointing to specific clauses in the trust document. "Real estate holdings, investment accounts, business interests, all carefully managed and grown over the past 20 years. The current value is approximately $12 million. The number seemed impossible, so far outside my frame of reference that my brain couldn't quite process it. 12 million? But why didn't anyone tell me? Why did my parents? Because Elena was very specific about the conditions for accessing the trust," Maddox interrupted gently. "She'd seen too many young people inherit money and waste it on foolish decisions. She wanted you to be mature enough to handle wealth responsibly, or to be in a situation where you truly needed protection from someone trying to exploit you." He pulled out another document, this one bearing yesterday's date. "I filed the activation paperwork this afternoon, after you called me from the gas station. As of 6 hours ago, you became one of the wealthiest women in the state." The irony was almost laughable. While Glen had been systematically stripping away my financial independence, I'd been sitting on a fortune that dwarfed anything he could have imagined. While he'd been conditioning me to feel grateful for his financial support, I'd actually been the one with real wealth. This changes everything, I breathed, feeling a transformation beginning in my chest, a straightening of my spine that had nothing to do with posture and everything to do with power. It changes everything, Maddox confirmed. Glen Jensen thought he was abandoning a helpless dependent wife with no resources and no options. What he actually did was activate a trust fund and trigger fraud investigations into his systematic theft of marital assets that legally belonged to someone worth $12 million. For the first time since Glen's abandonment, I felt something approaching genuine amusement. He has no idea, does he? None whatsoever. And when we walk into your house tomorrow morning, because that house, along with everything else he thinks he owns, is about to become a very expensive legal liability for him, he's going to learn exactly how catastrophic his assumptions have been. I thought about Glen driving home tonight, probably congratulating himself on his clever manipulation, planning his new life with Kayla White, believing he'd successfully discarded the inconvenient wife who'd outlived her usefulness. He was about to discover that Taylor Gray had never been the helpless dependent he'd imagined. She'd been a sleeping heiress, and he'd just provided the wake-up call. By 3 in the morning, the storm outside had finally broken, and Uncle Maddox's office had been transformed into something resembling a war room. Carl White had returned with 2 additional team members, a sharp-eyed woman named Sydney Gray, who specialized in forensic accounting, and a quiet man named Hunter Stiles, who was apparently Maddox's nephew and head of digital intelligence operations. The beauty of Glen's arrogance, Sydney was explaining as she spread financial documents across the conference table, is that he documented everything. Men who think they're untouchable rarely bother to cover their tracks properly. She'd been working for the past 2 hours, accessing databases and financial records, through what I was learning were perfectly legal but impressively sophisticated investigative channels. What she'd discovered was a systematic pattern of financial manipulation that went far beyond anything I'd suspected. Your husband has been moving marital assets into shell companies and offshore accounts for the past 18 months, Sydney continued, pointing to a complex web of transactions highlighted on her laptop screen. But here's the fascinating part. He's been using your social security number and forged signatures to establish some of these accounts. That's identity theft, Hunter added, his fingers flying across his own laptop keyboard. Federal felony, with enhanced penalties because it was committed against a spouse. But it gets better, or worse, depending on your perspective. The information they'd uncovered was staggering. Glen hadn't just been preparing to leave me with nothing. He'd been actively stealing assets that, thanks to my grandmother's trust, now legally belonged to someone with the resources to pursue criminal prosecution. The house we'd lived in, the vacation property in Aspen, the investment accounts he'd transferred to his business partner, all of it had been purchased or funded with what was technically my money, since California law considered marital assets community property. The preliminary estimate, Sydney said, consulting her notes, is that Glen has misappropriated approximately $4.7 million in assets that should legally be considered yours. Between the identity theft, the fraud and the breach of fiduciary duty, we're looking at potential federal charges that could put him away for 15 to 20 years. But Uncle Maddox had been planning something more immediate than criminal prosecution. Legal justice takes time, he'd said, his pale eyes reflecting the kind of strategic thinking that had built his security empire. And while lawyers argue in courtrooms, Glen is probably planning to liquidate whatever assets he can access and disappear with his secretary. We need to move faster than the legal system. That's when he'd outlined his plan for the morning. A coordinated operation that would demonstrate to Glen exactly how completely he'd misjudged his situation. Carl would drive me home at precisely 8 a.m., when Glen would presumably be having his morning coffee and congratulating himself on his successful abandonment. But I wouldn't be returning as the broken, desperate woman he'd left at the gas station. The psychological impact is crucial, Maddox had explained. Glen's entire strategy depends on you being isolated, helpless, and desperate enough to accept whatever scraps he's willing to offer. When you walk through that door with professional security, completely composed and clearly in control, it's going to shatter his assumptions about the power dynamic. Hunter had been working on what he called digital preparation, ensuring that by the time I arrived home, Glen would be receiving calls from banks notifying him that accounts were being frozen, from lawyers informing him that legal proceedings were being initiated, and from business partners who'd suddenly developed concerns about their association with someone under federal investigation. Timing is everything, Hunter had said with the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd orchestrated similar operations before. He needs to understand that his world is falling apart at exactly the moment you demonstrate that yours is being rebuilt stronger than ever. But perhaps the most satisfying element of the plan was the simplest one. Carl would be accompanied by a locksmith and a legal process server, while I packed Glen's belongings, because the house, like everything else he thought he owned, was about to become legally problematic for him to occupy. Glen would be served with restraining orders, asset freezing injunctions, and formal notification that he was the target of multiple criminal investigations. The goal, Maddox had said as we'd finalized the details, is to demonstrate that abandoning you wasn't the end of your story, it was the beginning of his nightmare. Now, as dawn began to break over the city, I found myself feeling something I hadn't experienced in years, complete confidence in my own power. Glen had spent 7 years convincing me that I was fortunate to have his protection and support. In a few hours he was going to learn exactly how catastrophic it was to lose mine. As the sun rose over the city, casting golden light through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Uncle Maddox's office, I found myself receiving what amounted to a master class in psychological warfare and legal strategy. Sydney had pulled up a chair beside me, her laptop displaying what looked like a detailed dossier on Glen's entire life. Understanding your opponent is the first rule of any successful operation, she explained, scrolling through bank records, property deeds, and business filings that painted a picture of Glen's financial empire. Your husband isn't just a successful developer, he's been using his construction business to launder money for some very questionable clients. The documents she showed me revealed a complex web of shell companies, all connected to Jensen Development Corporation, but structured in ways that seemed designed to obscure the true source of funding. Construction projects that were vastly over-budgeted, with the excess funds disappearing into accounts controlled by Glen and his business partners. Money laundering? I asked, struggling to reconcile this information with the man I'd been married to for 7 years. Glen builds shopping centers and office complexes. How does that connect to money laundering? Hunter looked up from his own screen, where he'd been tracking digital communications between Glen and various business associates. Construction is one of the oldest tricks in the book for cleaning dirty money. You inflate the cost of projects, use cash-heavy subcontractors who don't ask questions about where their payments originate, and create invoices for work that was never actually performed. The evidence was damning. Projects that should have cost $2 million were being billed at $4 million. With the difference flowing through a network of accounts that Hunter's forensic software had traced to offshore banks in countries with strict financial privacy laws. Glen hadn't just been stealing from me, he'd been facilitating financial crimes that could trigger federal RICO investigations. This is why he was so confident about leaving you with nothing. Sydney continued, pointing to a series of transactions from the past 6 months. He thought you were just a naive wife who didn't understand business. He never imagined you might have the resources to conduct this kind of investigation. But Uncle Maddox had been focusing on something more personal than Glen's criminal enterprises. Taylor, I need you to understand something crucial about what's going to happen this morning. When you walk into that house, Glen is going to try every manipulation tactic he's ever used on you, but with 10 times the intensity because he'll be desperate. He'd pulled out what appeared to be a psychological profile, complete with behavioral predictions and recommended response strategies. Men like Glen operate from a playbook. When their initial abandonment strategy fails, they escalate to what we call the reconciliation offensive, sudden declarations of love, promises to change, claims that the abandonment was a test of your devotion. The profile was disturbingly accurate, describing manipulation techniques I'd experienced countless times during our marriage without recognizing them for what they were. Love bombing followed by withdrawal, gaslighting designed to make me question my own perceptions, financial control disguised as protection, all of it laid out in clinical detail. When that fails, Maddox continued, he'll shift to what we call victim inversion, claiming that you're being unreasonable, that your actions are destroying his life, that you're the real aggressor in the situation. He'll try to make you feel guilty for defending yourself. Carl had been quietly reviewing his own set of protocols, what appeared to be security procedures for high-risk domestic situations. Excuse me, Miss Gray," he said, correcting himself with a slight smile. "I need you to understand that my presence isn't just for show. Men who've been systematically abusing their spouses sometimes become violent when they realize they're losing control." The possibility of physical danger hadn't occurred to me.
Yay, Glenn had never raised a hand to me, had always prided himself on being too sophisticated for crude violence.
But as Carl explained the statistics on domestic violence escalation during divorce proceedings, I began to understand that emotional abusers often became physical abusers when their psychological tactics failed. "The goal this morning," Maddox summarized, "is to demonstrate overwhelming superiority in every aspect of the confrontation: financial, legal, psychological, and if necessary, physical. Glenn needs to understand that he's not just lost a wife, he's made an enemy with resources he can't match and connections he can't counter." As we prepared to leave for what felt like the most important performance of my life, Sydney handed me a thick folder containing copies of all the evidence they'd gathered. "This is your insurance policy," she said. "Everything Glenn has done, every crime he's committed, every lie he's told. It's all documented in here. He can't gaslight you anymore because you have the receipts." For the first time in 7 years, I was walking into a confrontation with Glen Jensen as an equal. Actually, I was walking in as his superior, and he had no idea what was about to hit him. The drive back to Riverside Heights felt like traveling through a different world than the one I'd left 12 hours earlier. Carl navigated the morning traffic with professional efficiency, while I sat in the back seat, reviewing the evidence files Sydney had prepared and marveling at how completely Glenn had underestimated the resources now at my disposal. The locksmith, a compact man named Rodriguez, who clearly had experience with delicate domestic situations, rode in a separate vehicle behind us. Hunter had coordinated with local law enforcement to ensure that when Glenn inevitably tried to claim I was trespassing or stealing, the responding officers would already be briefed on the legal complexities of the situation. As we turned into my neighborhood, though I was beginning to think of it as Glenn's soon-to-be former neighborhood, Carl's phone buzzed with updates from the team that had been working through the night. "Phase 1 is complete," he reported, glancing at me in the rearview mirror. "Mr. Jensen's business accounts have been frozen pending investigation, and his attorney received formal notification an hour ago." The coordination was impressive. While Glenn had presumably been sleeping peacefully beside his secretary, confident that he'd successfully discarded his problematic wife, Uncle Maddox's team had been systematically dismantling his financial empire. Bank accounts frozen, business partners notified of pending investigations, and legal papers filed that would make it impossible for him to liquidate assets or flee the jurisdiction. His phone started ringing at 6 a.m. Hunter's voice crackled through Carl's communication system. First his bank, then his business attorney, then 3 different clients who'd received anonymous tips about federal investigations into Jensen Development Corporation. He's probably wondering how his perfectly planned abandonment turned into a disaster so quickly. I found myself studying the streets of my neighborhood with new eyes, seeing the expensive homes and manicured lawns as evidence of the criminal enterprise that Glenn had been operating under the guise of legitimate business. How many of these properties had been built with laundered money? How many of my neighbors were unknowingly living in monuments to financial crime? As we pulled into the circular driveway of the house I'd called home for 5 years, I could see Glenn's silhouette through the kitchen window. He appeared to be pacing while talking on the phone, his body language suggesting agitation and growing panic. "Perfect. Remember," Carl said as he put the Suburban in park, "you're not here to negotiate or explain. You're here to collect your belongings and inform Mr. Jensen of the new reality. Everything else is just theater designed to demonstrate your position of strength." The locksmith had already begun working on the front door, replacing the existing locks with new ones that would deny Glenn access to what was about to become my property exclusively. The legal documentation Sydney had prepared was comprehensive: restraining orders that would prevent Glenn from returning to the house, asset seizure orders that gave me legal possession of all marital property, and criminal complaint forms that had already been filed with federal authorities. Through the kitchen window, I could see Glenn's face clearly now, and the transformation from his usual confident composure to barely controlled panic was remarkable. He was still wearing the expensive silk pajamas I'd given him for Christmas, his hair disheveled, and his expression increasingly frantic as he juggled multiple phone calls from what were presumably his attorney, his bank, and his business partners. Carl had positioned himself strategically between the front door and Glen's car, a casual stance that nonetheless communicated his ability to prevent any attempt at flight. The process server was approaching from the side yard, legal documents in hand, timing his arrival to coincide with my entry into the house. "Miss Gray," the locksmith called softly, "new locks are installed. Here are your keys." He handed me a set of keys that felt heavier than they should have, weighted with the symbolic transfer of power they represented. As I walked toward the front door, my front door now legally and exclusively, I could see Glen rushing toward the foyer, presumably to demand explanations for the morning's cascade of legal disasters. He was about to get explanations, but not the kind he was expecting. The woman walking through this door wasn't the same person he'd abandoned at Miller's Creek gas station. She wasn't soaking wet, desperate, or dependent on his mercy. She was dry, professionally dressed, flanked by security, and backed by $12 million and a team of investigators who'd spent the night documenting his crimes. Glen Jensen had been so focused on discarding his inconvenient wife that he'd failed to notice he was actually attacking a sleeping heiress with the resources to destroy him. In approximately 30 seconds, he was going to learn the difference between those two very different opponents. I turned the new key in the lock and stepped into what was about to become the most satisfying confrontation of my life. The moment I stepped through the front door, Glen's voice hit me like a physical assault, carrying all the entitled indignation of a man who'd never been challenged by consequences for his actions. He came barreling down the hallway from the kitchen, still clutching his phone in one hand and gesticulating wildly with the other.
"Taylor."
"Thank God you're home," he said, his voice pitched with the kind of performative relief that would have fooled me yesterday, but now sounded like amateur theater.
"I've been getting the most insane phone calls this morning."
"Someone's been spreading malicious rumors about my business, freezing accounts. It's obviously some kind of coordinated attack by my competitors." He stopped abruptly when he noticed Carl standing quietly behind me, taking in the tall, professionally dressed man, with the kind of assessment that suggested Glen's survival instincts were finally beginning to engage.
"Who is this?"
"Taylor, why is there a stranger in our house? This is Carl White," I said, my voice carrying a calm authority that felt foreign and thrilling. "He's my security consultant, and this isn't our house anymore, Glen. It's my house." The words hit him like a slap, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and the first flickers of genuine fear. "Your house? Taylor, what are you talking about? Have you lost your mind? You don't own anything." He was interrupted by a firm knock at the door. Through the glass panels, I could see the process server waiting with his leather portfolio of legal documents. "That would be for you," I said, stepping aside, as Carl moved to open the door. "Glen Jensen?" the process server asked in the crisp, professional tone of someone who'd delivered bad news to powerful men before. "Yes, but I don't know what this is about," Glen replied, his voice rising with panic, as the morning's disasters began to coalesce into a pattern he couldn't ignore. "You're being served with multiple legal documents," the server said, handing Glen a thick stack of papers. "Restraining orders, asset freezing injunctions, and formal notification that you're the subject of federal criminal investigations for money laundering, identity theft, and fraud." Glen's face went white as he rifled through the documents, his hands beginning to shake as the legal language spelled out the complete dismantling of his carefully constructed empire.
"This is impossible."
"Taylor, what have you done? You don't have the resources for this kind of legal action. You don't even have your own bank account." "Actually," I said, pulling out my own copy of the trust documentation, "I have $12 million and the best legal team money can buy. Turns out my grandmother left me quite a bit more than just memories." The revelation hit him like a physical blow, his knees actually buckling slightly as the implications crashed over him. $12 million, that's impossible. Your family has no money. I checked your background thoroughly before we married. You checked my parents' finances, I corrected. You never thought to investigate my grandmother's estate, because you assumed that small-town women couldn't accumulate serious wealth. That assumption just became the most expensive mistake of your life. Carl had been quietly coordinating with the locksmith, who was now changing the locks on the back door as well. The symbolism was deliberate and unmistakable. Glen was being systematically excluded from every space he'd once controlled. "Taylor, listen to me," Glen said, his voice taking on the manipulative sweetness that had once made me question my own perceptions. "Whatever's happening here, we can work it out. I know I hurt you last night, and I'm sorry. I was stressed about business, not thinking clearly. But we're married, we're supposed to work through problems together, not involve lawyers and strangers." The gaslighting attempt was so textbook that I almost laughed. "We're not working through anything, Glen. You systematically stole marital assets, committed identity theft using my personal information, and abandoned me at a gas station in a thunderstorm. The only thing we're working through now is how quickly you can pack your belongings and leave my property." "Your property?" His voice cracked with genuine panic now. "Taylor, you're being irrational. You can't just decide that everything we built together belongs to you. I'm your husband. I have rights." "Actually," Carl interjected quietly, "according to the restraining order you were just served, you have the right to remain silent, and the right to leave this property within the next 2 hours. You also have the right to an attorney, which I'd strongly recommend you exercise immediately." Glen turned to me with the desperate look of a man watching his world collapse in real time. "Taylor, please. Whatever they've told you, whatever lies they've filled your head with, this isn't you. You're not vindictive. You're not cruel. Don't let these people turn you into someone you're not." I looked at him steadily, feeling the last vestiges of my old conditioning finally crumble away. "You're absolutely right, Glen. I'm not vindictive or cruel. I'm just someone who refuses to be stolen from, lied to, and abandoned anymore. The person I'm becoming is exactly who I always was before you convinced me to be smaller." Glen's phone rang again, the shrill sound cutting through the tension like a knife. He glanced at the screen, and his face went another shade paler. "It's my attorney," he said, as if somehow this would change the trajectory of his rapidly deteriorating morning. "Take it," I said simply. "I'm sure he has fascinating news about your legal situation." Glen answered the call, turning slightly away, as if privacy could somehow shield him from the conversation everyone in the room could hear. "Richard." "Yes, I got the papers. This is obviously some kind of mistake." "What do you mean, probable cause? I haven't done anything illegal." I watched his shoulders slump progressively as his attorney apparently explained the reality of his situation. The federal investigation wasn't a bluff or a negotiating tactic. It was a legitimate criminal probe with evidence that Glen's own arrogance had provided. "Money laundering. Richard, that's insane. The construction business is complex, but everything I've done is—" "What do you mean, documented financial fraud?" Carl had positioned himself strategically near the living room windows, from where he could monitor both Glen's increasing agitation and the approach of additional vehicles. "Miss Gray," he said quietly, "the forensic accountant has arrived, along with the document recovery specialist." Through the window, I could see Sydney stepping out of a black sedan, carrying what appeared to be specialized equipment for accessing digital files and secured documents. Behind her, Hunter emerged from a second vehicle with several boxes of what looked like evidence collection materials. "Richard, I need you to fix this," Glen was saying into his phone, his voice rising with desperation. "I don't care what it costs. File injunctions, challenge everything. Taylor doesn't have the legal standing to—" He paused, listening. "What do you mean, she has standing? She's just my wife." "Actually," I interjected, unable to resist the opening, "I'm your soon-to-be ex-wife, who happens to be worth considerably more than you are. And unlike you, my wealth wasn't acquired through criminal activity." Glen ended his call and turned to face me, his expression cycling between rage and panic. "Taylor, you don't understand what you're doing. My business supports dozens of families. If you destroy Jensen Development Corporation, you're not just hurting me, you're putting innocent people out of work. The same innocent people you've been using to launder money for criminal organizations." I asked, pulling out one of Sydney's reports. "The same employees whose pension funds you've been embezzling. Those innocent people, The accusation hit home with devastating accuracy. Glen's face went slack as he realized that his criminal activities hadn't been as cleverly concealed as he'd believed. How could you possibly know about? He started, then stopped himself, understanding too late that every word was further confirmation of his guilt. I know everything, Glen, I said simply. Every hidden account, every forged document, every illegal transaction. The question now isn't whether you're going to prison, it's how long you'll be there, and how much of your stolen wealth you'll be forced to return to the people you've been robbing. Glen's panic was palpable now, sweat beading on his forehead, despite the cool morning air flowing through the open front door. He set his phone down with trembling hands and attempted what I recognized as his last resort manipulation strategy, the desperate appeal to emotion that had worked so effectively throughout our marriage. Taylor, sweetheart, please, he said, his voice dropping to the intimate tone he'd once used to convince me I was overreacting to his suspicious behavior. I know things look bad right now, but you have to believe me. I never meant for any of this to hurt you. Everything I did, every decision I made, was to build a better life for us. The performance was masterful in its calculated vulnerability. Glen had always been skilled at shifting between aggression and victimhood, making me feel simultaneously threatened and protective. But watching him deploy these tactics while flanked by federal evidence and my security team, I could see the manipulation for what it had always been, a sophisticated form of psychological warfare. The money laundering was to protect our future, he continued, taking a step closer until Carl's subtle movement made him reconsider. Those clients you're so concerned about, they were threatening our business, our safety. I had to play along to keep us secure. By stealing $4.7 million from marital assets, I asked consulting Sydney's financial analysis. By forging my signature on documents that transferred property into your personal accounts. How exactly was that protecting our future? Glen's expression flickered between wounded innocence and cold calculation. You don't understand how business works, Taylor. Sometimes you have to make difficult choices to survive in competitive markets. I was shielding you from the complexities because I wanted to preserve your innocence. My innocence, I repeated, tasting the condescension that had poisoned our entire relationship. Is that what you call it when you systematically steal from your spouse, while convincing her she should be grateful for your financial support? The front door opened again, admitting Sydney and Hunter with their evidence collection equipment. Glen watched them enter with growing horror, finally understanding that this wasn't a negotiation or a temporary setback, it was a complete dismantling of his life. Taylor, you're making a terrible mistake, he said, his voice hardening as his manipulation tactics failed to gain traction. Do you have any idea what kind of people I've been dealing with? What they'll do if they think you're responsible for exposing their operations? The threat was subtle but unmistakable, designed to make me afraid of the consequences of pursuing justice. It was the same intimidation strategy he'd used throughout our marriage, making me feel responsible for managing his problems while he benefited from my silence. Are you threatening me, Glen? I asked, my voice carrying a calm that surprised us both. I'm trying to protect you, he said quickly, realizing his mistake. These people don't care that you're innocent. If they think you're a threat, then it's fortunate that I have professional security and federal protection, I replied, watching his last manipulation attempt crumble like everything else he'd built on lies. Sydney had set up her equipment on Glen's own mahogany desk, a pointed symbolism that wasn't lost on anyone in the room. The irony of using his personal workspace to uncover his crimes added a layer of poetic justice to the morning's proceedings. Within minutes, her specialized forensic software was accessing files that Glen had thought were securely deleted, financial records that painted an even more damning picture than our overnight investigation had revealed. This is absolutely remarkable, Sydney said, her voice carrying the professional appreciation of someone who'd seen sophisticated financial crimes before, but rarely ones this thoroughly documented. Mr. Jensen has been keeping meticulous records of every illegal transaction, apparently for blackmail purposes against his criminal associates. The screen displayed a digital treasure trove of incriminating evidence. Spreadsheets tracking millions of dollars in laundered money, email chains discussing the best methods for concealing criminal proceeds, And most damaging of all, a hidden folder labeled insurance that contained recorded phone conversations where Glen explicitly discussed strategies for washing dirty money through his construction projects. "You recorded your own crimes?" I asked, genuinely amazed by the depth of his arrogance. Glen's face had gone ashen as Sydney pulled up file after file of communications with known money laundering operations. "Insurance," he said weakly, as if this explanation would somehow mitigate the devastating evidence. "In case anyone tried to make me the fall guy for their operations." Hunter looked up from his own laptop, where he'd been analyzing Glen's digital communications with the systematic thoroughness of someone who understood the legal implications of every byte of data. The insurance strategy just became evidence of racketeering conspiracy. These recordings prove conscious participation in ongoing criminal enterprise, not coercion. But the most explosive discovery came when Sydney accessed what appeared to be Glen's personal files, the ones he'd convinced me to sign without reading. My hands shook as she displayed the documents on her screen, the legal language now crystal clear in its devastating implications. "These aren't insurance forms," Sydney announced, her voice tight with anger that barely contained her professional composure. "These are comprehensive property transfer documents that moved every marital asset into Glen's individual ownership, life insurance policies with Kayla White as the sole beneficiary, and what appears to be a detailed contract with a private investigation firm to document evidence of your supposed mental instability." The words hit me like physical blows, each revelation worse than the last. Glen hadn't just been planning to abandon me, he'd been systematically building a legal framework to have me declared incompetent, presumably to justify his theft of marital assets, and to eliminate any potential interference with his criminal operations. "Mental instability," I whispered, reading over Sydney's shoulder as she scrolled through psychological evaluations that Glen had commissioned based on secretly recorded conversations and deliberately manipulated situations designed to make me appear unhinged. "Dr. Harrison's report concludes that you show signs of paranoid delusions and financial irresponsibility," Sydney continued, her professional composure barely containing her outrage at the systematic psychological abuse she was uncovering. "The evidence cited includes your irrational concerns about Glen's business practices and your unreasonable requests for financial transparency." The scope of the manipulation was breathtaking in its cruelty. Glen had weaponized my own attempts to understand our marriage problems, turning every question I'd asked about his behavior into evidence of mental instability. Every time I'd expressed concern about his late nights or suspicious phone calls, he'd been documenting my paranoia for use in what was essentially a psychological assassination designed to discredit me completely. "Look at this timeline," Hunter said, pointing to a calendar file that showed the premeditation went back over 2 years. "Glen began commissioning psychological evaluations 18 months ago. The property transfers were initiated 14 months ago. The life insurance policies naming Kayla as beneficiary were purchased 10 months ago. You were planning to have me committed," I said, the full horror of his scheme finally crystallizing with devastating clarity. Everything, the abandonment, the financial theft, even bringing Kayla to notarize those documents, it was all designed to make me look unstable so you could steal everything legally and have me locked away where I couldn't interfere. Glen's silence was confirmation enough, but Sydney had found even more damning evidence. "There's correspondence with a private psychiatric facility," she said, her voice hollow with disgust. "Glen had already made preliminary arrangements for your involuntary commitment, pending the completion of Dr. Harrison's evaluation. The facility was an expensive private institution known for treating wealthy patients with discretion. Glen had planned to have me declared mentally incompetent, steal my inheritance, and warehouse me in a luxury prison where his visiting schedule would determine my only contact with the outside world." "The beautiful part," I said, surprising myself with how calm my voice sounded, "is that all of this evidence of your crimes was created using equipment and accounts funded by my grandmother's money. You've been documenting your own systematic abuse with resources that legally belong to your victim." Glen's face crumpled as the mathematical precision of his own destruction became clear. The revelation of Glen's psychological warfare campaign seemed to break something fundamental in his carefully maintained composure. Gone was the smooth businessman who'd abandoned me at a gas station 12 hours earlier, replaced by a desperate man whose carefully constructed world was collapsing in real time before an audience of federal investigators and security professionals. "You don't understand," he said, his voice taking on a frantic edge as he watched Sydney compile evidence that would ensure decades in federal prison. "Everything I did was necessary. You were becoming a liability, asking too many questions, threatening to expose operations that people kill to protect. So your solution was to drive me insane?" I asked, my voice remarkably steady despite the rage building in my chest like a controlled explosion. "To gaslight me into questioning my own sanity so you could have me institutionalized and steal everything I owned." Glen's phone began ringing again, a different ringtone that made him freeze with absolute terror. His face went white as he stared at the screen, and I could see his hands beginning to shake uncontrollably. "That's Maddox Volkov," he whispered, staring at the screen like it was a death sentence. "He's one of the clients whose money you're about to expose. If he thinks I've compromised his operations—" The name meant nothing to me, but Carl's subtle shift in posture and the way his hand moved closer to his concealed weapon suggested it should. "Russian organized crime," he murmured quietly, his voice carrying the professional assessment of someone who'd dealt with international criminal organizations before. "Money laundering through construction is one of their primary operations in this region." Glen let the call go to voicemail, but his hands were shaking so violently he could barely hold the phone. The confident manipulator who'd spent 7 years controlling every aspect of my life was disintegrating before my eyes. Reduced to a terrified criminal who'd finally encountered consequences he couldn't charm, threaten, or buy his way out of. "Taylor, you have no idea what you've unleashed," he said, his voice cracking with genuine panic. "These people don't care about legal procedures or federal investigations. When they decide someone is a threat, that person simply disappears. No trial, no prison, just gone." "Are you saying you've been laundering money for the Russian mob?" I asked, watching his face confirm what his words were implying. The scope of his criminal enterprise was expanding beyond anything I'd imagined. "I didn't have a choice." Glen exploded, his careful facade finally cracking completely under the pressure of mounting evidence and imminent arrest. "They approached me 3 years ago with an offer I couldn't refuse. Work with them, or watch my business burn down with me inside it." Hunter looked up from his analysis with something approaching excitement, recognizing the legal implications of Glen's admission. "If that's true, Mr. Jensen just became a potential federal witness against organized crime. The Justice Department would be very interested in his cooperation, and the Witness Protection Program becomes a viable option." The suggestion made Glen laugh bitterly, a sound devoid of any humor. "Cooperation? You think testifying against Volkov is going to save me? The only thing that saves me now is making this entire investigation disappear, and the only way to do that is—" He stopped himself, but the implication hung in the air like a physical threat. Glen was desperate enough to consider eliminating the evidence, which meant eliminating the witnesses who'd discovered it. The transformation was complete. The man I'd married was gone, replaced by a cornered criminal who just revealed exactly how dangerous he'd always been beneath his sophisticated exterior. "Is that a threat, Mr. Jensen?" Carl asked, his voice carrying the dangerous calm of someone prepared for violence and trained to respond to it with overwhelming force. "It's reality," Glen said, his mask finally dropping entirely to reveal the predator he'd always been. "You think you're so smart, Taylor, with your mysterious inheritance and your private investigators, but you've just signed all our death warrants. Mine, yours, and everyone in this room who knows what we've discovered." The admission was being recorded by Hunter's surveillance equipment, adding witness intimidation and threats against federal investigations to Glen's rapidly expanding list of federal charges. Each word was digging his legal grave deeper, while simultaneously providing prosecutors with exactly the kind of evidence they needed to pursue maximum sentences. "Actually, Glen," I said quietly, feeling a calm settle over me that surprised us both, "I think you'll find that threatening federal witnesses in the presence of law enforcement is about to become the least of your problems." As if summoned by my words, the sound of multiple vehicles pulling into the driveway cut through Glen's desperate threats like a blade through silk. Through the living room windows, I could see black SUV with government plates surrounding the house, federal agents emerging with the kind of coordinated precision that suggested this operation had been planned down to the minute. Glen's face went from pale to gray as he realized that his threats against federal witnesses had been recorded by surveillance equipment, and that backup was already here. The sound of multiple vehicles pulling into the driveway cut through Glen's desperate threats like a blade through silk. Through the living room windows, I could see black SUVs with government plates surrounding the house, federal agents emerging with the kind of coordinated precision that suggested this operation had been planned down to the minute and executed with military efficiency. FBI, Carl announced unnecessarily, as agents in tactical gear positioned themselves around the property's perimeter with the systematic thoroughness of professionals who'd conducted hundreds of similar operations. Your uncle's connections in federal law enforcement apparently found Mr. Jensen's confession quite compelling. Glen's face went from pale to gray as he realized that his threats against federal witnesses had been recorded by the surveillance equipment Hunter had discreetly activated when we'd entered the house. Everything he'd said, the admission of money laundering, the threats against my life, the confirmation of organized crime connections, was now documented evidence that would ensure his cooperation with federal prosecutors, whether he wanted to provide it or not. "Taylor, please," Glen whispered, his voice breaking as the weight of his situation finally penetrated the arrogance that had protected him from reality for so long. "If you testify against me, if this goes to trial, Volkov will kill both of us. You have to understand, we could disappear somewhere, start over, use your inheritance to—" "What I understand," I said, watching federal agents approach the front door with the confidence of people who held all the legal cards, "is that you've spent 7 years systematically destroying my independence, my confidence, and my sense of reality. You planned to have me committed to a mental institution so you could steal everything I owned. And when that plan failed, you threatened to have me killed." Agent Sarah Chen entered with a team of forensic specialists who immediately began cataloging evidence that Sydney and Hunter had prepared for them. The coordination was flawless, suggesting that Uncle Maddox's connections in federal law enforcement ran deeper than I'd imagined, and that this morning's confrontation had been orchestrated as much to gather additional evidence as to protect me from Glen's desperation. "Mr. Jensen," Agent Chen said, approaching Glen with handcuffs and the kind of professional demeanor that suggested she'd arrested far more dangerous criminals than a suburban money launderer, "you're under arrest for money laundering, racketeering, identity theft, conspiracy to commit fraud, and threatening federal witnesses. You have the right to remain silent, and I strongly recommend you exercise that right until you've consulted with an attorney." As the Miranda rights were read, Glen's eyes found mine one last time. The manipulative charm was gone, the entitled confidence had evaporated, and what remained was a broken man who'd finally encountered consequences he couldn't charm, threaten, or buy his way out of. The transformation was complete. The sophisticated businessman who'd controlled every aspect of my life for 7 years had been reduced to a common criminal in handcuffs. "The Justice Department is offering witness protection," Agent Chen told me, as Glen was led away in handcuffs, his expensive silk pajamas, a ridiculous contrast to the federal restraints. "Given the organized crime connections and the threats that were made, we recommend you consider federal protection until the prosecution is complete and the associated criminal organizations have been neutralized." But as I watched Glen disappear into the back of a federal transport vehicle, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: complete safety in my own power. The woman who'd been abandoned at a gas station no longer existed. In her place stood someone who owned $12 million, commanded the respect of federal law enforcement, and had just dismantled a criminal empire with nothing more than inherited wealth and the courage to use it strategically. "Agent Chen," I said, surprising myself with the authority in my voice, "I appreciate the offer, but I think I'll rely on my own security arrangements. I've recently discovered that I'm far less vulnerable than I used to believe." The house felt different now, larger somehow, as if Glen's presence had been compressing the space around me for years. Carl began coordinating with the federal team to ensure the property was secure, while Sydney and Hunter packed up their equipment with the satisfaction of professionals who'd completed a successful operation. Uncle Maddox arrived as the federal vehicles were departing, his expression mixing paternal pride with professional satisfaction. "How do you feel, sweetheart?" he asked, wrapping me in one of his bear hugs. "Like myself," I said, and realized it was true. For the first time in 7 years, I felt like Taylor Gray rather than Mrs. Glen Jensen, like someone who's been sleeping for a very long time and just woke up. "Glen Jensen made a lot of mistakes," Maddox said, watching the federal convoy disappear down the street. "But his biggest one was thinking that Taylor Gray was someone who could be discarded. He had no idea who he was really dealing with." Looking around at my house now, legally and completely, I had to agree. 3 weeks later, I was sitting in Uncle Maddox's conference room again, but this time the atmosphere was one of quiet satisfaction rather than crisis management. Sydney had spread the final forensic accounting reports across the table, documenting the complete scope of Glen's criminal enterprise and its systematic dismantling. "The federal investigation has expanded beyond anything we initially imagined," she reported, her voice carrying the professional pride of someone who'd helped expose a major criminal conspiracy. "Glen's cooperation with the Justice Department has led to indictments against 14 associates, including 3 members of the Volkov organization. The numbers were staggering. Over $47 million in laundered money had been traced through Glen's construction projects, with victims ranging from small business owners, whose legitimate contracts had been inflated to hide criminal proceeds, to pension funds that had been systematically looted by Glen's business partners. The employees you were worried about," Hunter added, consulting his own files, "are actually going to benefit from the investigation. The federal asset forfeiture program is using recovered funds to make them whole for the pension contributions that Glen had been embezzling." But perhaps the most satisfying development was the fate of Kayla White, Glen's secretary and presumed romantic partner. Far from being the innocent victim of Glen's manipulations, the investigation had revealed her as a knowing participant in the money laundering scheme, using her notary certification to authenticate fraudulent documents, and her access to Glen's files to facilitate the transfer of stolen assets. "Miss White received a federal indictment yesterday," Agent Chen informed me during our weekly briefing call. "Conspiracy to commit money laundering, accessory to identity theft, and perjury. She's looking at 8 to 12 years, assuming she doesn't cooperate with the prosecution." The irony wasn't lost on me. Glen had abandoned me for a woman who was now facing nearly as much prison time as he was, their grand romance reduced to a criminal conspiracy that would destroy both their lives. Glen himself had aged visibly during his 3 weeks in federal custody. The confident businessman who'd abandoned me at Miller's Creek gas station had been replaced by a hollow-eyed man in an orange jumpsuit who'd traded his silence for a reduced sentence that would still keep him in prison until he was nearly 60. "The psychological evaluation reports make for interesting reading," Uncle Maddox said, sliding a file across the table. "Turns out the man who tried to have you declared mentally unstable is showing classic signs of narcissistic personality disorder with sociopathic tendencies." The evaluation painted a picture of someone so fundamentally incapable of empathy that my 7 years of marriage had essentially been a relationship with a psychological predator. The realization should have been devastating, but instead it felt liberating. I hadn't failed at marriage, I'd survived something that was never a marriage at all. "There's something else," Agent Chen had told me during our call. "The Russian organized crime connections have led to a broader federal task force. Your case isn't just about individual justice anymore, it's become a significant victory against organized financial crime." Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.